Hello everybody, welcome to another video. Today it is the 6th of September. We're looking at really important updates from the past 48 hours, beginning with the Kharkiv front around Pishchane. We'll shake things up and actually start over there, and then work our way southwards towards New York, and then Pokrovsk, Selydove, and the Vavcha river fronts, and finish off by looking at Vuhledar. So today we'll do that at the end of the video. To zoom in, you guys can see the advances conducted by the Russian forces over the past 48 hours in yellow. And you can see in particular, they've advanced westwards 2.9 square kilometers. This has been backed up, first of all, by Deep State and Petrenko, but also based on a video released by the Ukrainian side yesterday of their artillery hitting a Russian T-72 tank. Their artillery hit it while the tank was moving, which is very difficult to pull off, but it also verifies to us that the Russians are not just advancing here with ground forces through these really dense tree lines in some cases. Sometimes you can't even call them tree lines because they're just large blobs of forested area. And it's, of course, being utilized by the Russians to their advantage, but now it appears they've paved the way for vehicles and tanks to push through. And at this point, based on Russia's furthest westward extent, they are only 4.1 kilometers away from Hlushkivka. And again, you cut off one of these villages and you sever the one road connection between the Ukrainians and Kupiansk. If we zoom out, we can see that. And the Ukrainians that are currently defending much further southwards in various other villages that are located east of the very wide Oskil River. So, Borova's here, the Zherbets River bridgehead that we always talk about. And there's only one route that is right now very close to Russian actual physical control, but of course they're firing towards it on an incessant basis, and that's through Hlushkivka. It's through any number of these villages over here that the Russians are approaching, and so that's of course a concern. At the same time, it's not just about the villages, it's also about the elevation that the Russians are securing with not enough Ukrainian ground resistance. From the air, of course, we see these artillery compilations and FPV strikes, but on the ground we can see the Russian advances, for instance, over here, consolidating control over additional portions of ravines and nearby forested areas. And then to the north, again, the Russians really beginning to chip away at a lot of Ukraine's holdings in these fields over here that are located southeast of Kupiansk, higher elevated areas that directly overlook this highway that leads into Kupiansk. You could see it marked in red. Of course, also overlooks the suburbs that I'm marking here with an X. One of them is a rail station and a bridge that connects across the Oskil River. So those are currently in operation or have nearby pontoon bridges. So the Russians, of course, would like to get within the range of shelling those sort of positions as the Ukrainians conduct transit across. And then just to look to the south, again, you have this Russian branching off that occurred past Pishchane. Pishchane really was able to create a large gap in Ukraine's line in that salient helped the Russians expand in all directions. In the southern direction, taking over control over, again, fields that are rather open in their nature because there are not a lot of trenches here that were built by the Ukrainians. They were not expecting an assault from the north. And now that's, of course, putting pressure on Ukraine's supply lines, leading towards areas where fierce battles are going on, like Samakivka, because, again, you have the main Ukrainian arteries in this region right next to the river, because then it's easy to, of course, reach them through pontoon bridges and such. So you have, for instance, Zacharizhova over here. You have to the north, Kurachlakivka, Lazova. It connects to the villages near the river, and then from there acts as a conduit towards the front line. But right now, due to this Russian advance occurring to the north, where this X is located, it's putting that sort of northern pressure onto the supply route, which, again, is not even on a paved road. It's just through open fields that the Russians are now on sort of similar elevation to, because all this field marked in X is on the same sort of hill that the Russians are currently begin to clear through. Now, if you zoom in on a local level and you see what's going on in Samakivka, the Russian forces have taken over 4.7 square kilometers. They really are focusing right now on the northern entrance to the village, where you can see there is a higher elevated area. It's a bit to the southwest of Novoselivske, but it is an important hill because it overlooks in a really radical manner the Ukrainian positions remaining along this valley line here, where you have all the trees, and then also in some of the remaining holdouts in the houses of Samakivka. And really, it's a minority of the village at this point that the Russians are focusing on clearing out, because a lot of it is either under Russian control or in a gray zone. And so at that point, you have a sort of component of the Ukrainian defense here, whether it be from the 77th Air Mobile Brigade, this reconnaissance unit here, a few other smaller FPV units or territorial defense battalions. They all have these positions still near the front line, located in an area that is compromised from the north without large static defendable positions or villages. And so that is a threat, and it's why the Ukrainians do try to remain and drag out the fighting in the actual areas where they did have those sort of static defensible places to dig in, including Semachivka, and then also this village here, Myazorazivka, Andriivka to the south, all of them still contested due to this Ukrainian resistance. Now moving on to the Chasiv Yar front, we're zooming in and looking at an advance this time occurred north of the city. If you recall in my last video, I discussed a really important Russian advance where their forces here, which I believe would be a combination of some VDV elements, I don't think from the 98th Division, but other VDV units that are operating in this area, they were moved in addition to DPR, PR, artillery elements, and just motorized rifle units, pushed past Klishivka, which they had taken over previously, I think really at the beginning of the summer, and then just over the past few weeks took over height 215, which meant that the Russian forces were on rather high elevation, at least similar to the Ukrainian elevation located in the fields west of Klishivka. And this gave the Russians a perfect springboard to send in their own large quantity of squads to push through in a fast manner once they were able to find a gap in the Ukrainian line. And they were able to find this week due to the movement of the 93rd Brigade away from its location defending the southern flank of Chasiv Yar. As a result, there was a lack of troop density here, and 93rd is a huge unit, has probably upwards of 8,000 men in total, and around 4,000 of them were probably operating around here. So it's a significant amount of men to lose and really high caliber troops with a lot of good equipment. So the Russians, of course, saw the opportunity. They pounced on it, took over a large chunk of territory, and reached all the way to the canal line. Now, since then, there hasn't been an update from this area, but I do believe that the Russians here will try to solidify it by getting control of more holdings, particularly to the south, with the hope of finally cleansing a Ukrainian presence in this outpost in Andriivka, which really just serves to be a thorn in Russia's back if they want to just continue pushing westwards and clear out the entire canal line. But then you can see to the north here, they actually were able to cross over the canal as reported by Deep States. We know that Kalinina has been under their control for an extended period of time, and they've used the forested area south of that village as a haven for DRG operators to cross over the canal, which in this part of the line is not even actually in a depression. The canal here is actually really the water of it is transported through pipes. If you zoom in and you see, so it's actually a physical crossing. You don't have to go across any sort of lower depression, which makes it easier, of course, to go past this area without being spotted. Also, of course, because of the various trees here. So this was really its use for a while, the function of the Russian vector in this area, and then to branch off southwards or westwards to put pressure onto the Ukrainian western bank. But now they've actually been able to get a concrete control over warehouses and residential areas in western Kalinina. This is important because the area taken over by the Russians is located on rather high elevation. More generally, all of this sector that you see marked in the red rectangle is on higher elevation. It consists of these quarries and landfills, all these large sort of industrial areas, all of them on high elevation that is at least on par with the Chasiv Yar region, which means that the Russians would no longer be at a disadvantage trying to attack uphill because, first of all, they would have a northern flank, which, of course, diverts Ukrainian attention and puts pressure from another region, but then they'd also be able to annul any sort of potential disadvantage of attacking directly from the east from certain areas that may be at a lower elevation. Most notably, this forested region is actually on a bit of a valley. It's not that low in elevation, but it is lower than, for instance, the Ukrainian holdings in the center of Chasiv Yar. Same thing with this axis over here that you see in X, where all the forested areas are, and you have this like sort of local dirt path that's also on lower elevation. So it's just opening up a new opportunity for Russia, and it is something that would, in the long term, yield much less casualties than just continually trying to cross the canal and pushing through house to house, basement to basement, only through one section. That's something that it's possible it could be done, but it's something that would just drag out for so long and yield to so many more casualties than putting pressure from several areas. And now that we're getting to the Toretsk front and more generally the regions that are the most hot at the moment, it's important to note that some Russian sources are noting Ukrainian localized counterattacks. And one area that was mentioned was Toretsk. Now, since this report has come out from the Russian side, I haven't seen any movement of Ukrainian forces to take back any of the recent Russian forays. I haven't seen that, but it's entirely possible that the Ukrainians here are trying to, at the very least, stabilize their current holdings. And I'll zoom in on the ones that I think they're trying to hold on to specifically. It includes this slag heap over here, south of the center of Toretsk. This is so important because as the Russians put a lot of focus on this unitary route directly into the citadel of Toretsk, it's being overlooked by this one landfill that the Ukrainians are still on. And of course, any sort of Ukrainian, or I should say Russian forces that are pushing through the forested region here or dachas, they are seen, their line of sight is directly to the east of the Ukrainian positions right at the front line. So it really is a big advantage to them. Same thing with this correctional facility, having such a strengthened structure to really hide within and fire towards the southern flank of the Russian sort of spearhead and salient. It's a very important holding. And so the Ukrainians definitely have poured into resources, and maybe they are even trying to conduct counterattacks here and have succeeded in, at the very least, creating a buffer zone to prevent the Russians from pushing forward and taking them over. That's what we're seeing so far, that nothing has changed here, which for the time being is beneficial for the Ukrainians. Looking northwards, there were movements around Druzhba, so that's actually the opposite, where the Russians are just continuing with the momentum here. But I do know that, again, recently the Ukrainians in Toretsk did strengthen the size of the garrison by moving in at least certain elements of the 28th Mechanized Brigade back to defending here. At least one battalion is defending to the east here in Kurymivka, Ozaryanivka, and then another one at the very least is defending southwards near the Druzhba region due to the recent Russian pushes through that region. Now, looking at New York, this is where it's very interesting because for 3 weeks, there's been ambiguity about the situation. And I, for one, did not really touch the map since then. And I also didn't discuss it much because there was not a lot coming in from either side. The radio waves were pretty silent, actually. And there's probably good reason for that. But what I'll say is that over these past 3 weeks, it's being alleged that there were Ukrainian soldiers, not a huge amount, but there was a garrison of several squads of the Ukrainian armed forces that were holed up in this phenol plant. This sort of, I think it's like a plant production facility or creating certain chemicals, something of the sort for plants or fertilizer. And so they were in here, and it's a really large structure, a lot of materials to hide behind and fire through. So really it is an area that you could hold out in if you had the necessary resources for a really long time, and assaulting it directly would be extremely dangerous. So the Russians didn't do that, but they did try to bypass it and were successful in doing so. Again, earlier in August, pushing from two vectors, one from the west where that crossed over the river here past the Persagora, I think that's the name of the area over here, marked in southwestern New York. They crossed past it, took over the school that you see over here, and then made their way from the west into Nelipivka. At the same time, you had this parallel Russian attack pushed through a lot of the center of New York, including the train station, advanced a bit to the east, took over some of these dachas, residential areas, and then pushed along the local road directly into Nelipivka. So you had two vectors that essentially cut off the Ukrainians that were still holding out in this plant. And I don't know which unit they're from. I'm trying to get an idea, but maybe the 53rd Brigade, which is defending over here. And they sort of conjoined at the train station of Nelipivka, never actually taking it over in its entirety. But ever since then, there's been ambiguity because there were reports of the Ukrainians holding out in between the two vectors, which was always disputed and never fully confirmed. And then also the Ukrainians trying to conduct counterattacks towards this through this rail direction, you could say, to finally push the Russians out of the town itself. And now, over the past few days, it's been confirmed by Russian sources, a variety of them like Sofa General, and also by Ukrainian sources like Deep State showing on their maps the very same thing, which is that the Ukrainians organize a counterattack over here, and the units involved include the 12th National Guard Brigade Azov. This is important because this unit, I was talking about it a couple of weeks ago, and they were involved in defending around the Zharbets riverfront. They defended in the Serebryansky forestry, and again in Terny, on Polivka, those villages that we are very familiar with. They played a huge role actually, in holding the line over there and conducting artillery strikes towards the Russians. So we know that they have that battle experience. Now, a similarly named brigade, the 3rd Assault Brigade Azov, they conducted a localized counterattack a bit further north, which we also discussed, but you shouldn't confuse the two units. This one is a part of the National Guard structure, and they were moved in over the past week to help conduct this localized counterattack. And so this unit was created between late 2022 and early 2023. That's when it was in formation. Again, highly motivated units, a lot of volunteers, high quality unit, I would say, even though it was formed relatively recently, has a lot of Western equipment, some of the best infantry fighting vehicles, tanks that the Ukrainians have at their disposal, coming in from both Soviet stockpiles in the West. So they have basically everything you need to have a force that can conduct sort of these mobile attacks and push back the Russians, even if it's in not like a large scale, but just in a localized level, to sort of free a encirclement that may have been formed by the Russians. And so they have 6 infantry battalions. They include special purpose battalions, motorized battalions. All of those sort of units were put into the same brigade. And so it is a large one. It maybe has 4,000 forces, something of that ballpark. So more than some Ukrainian units that have around 2,000 men. This one has probably around 4,000 due to the amount of battalions. And so they were sent in with their large drone and artillery components and conducted very significant strikes onto Russian holdings across the river over here, the Torets River that splits New York. You can see the X's marking where there was a very significant shelling by the Azov Brigade. They took out a lot of these outposts that were used by Russian squads, using grenades in some cases, or FPVs, or just precision strikes. And then at the same time, they sent in their infantry fighting vehicles, attacked southwards through this unitary route after retaking Nelipivka, and were able to free the corridor to the phenol plant, which means there is now a direct connection between the Ukrainian rear and the Ukrainians defending. And I believe that from a Ukrainian perspective, the goal would be now to counterattack even more, not to just let the situation remain at the status quo, because you can see how narrow of a width this is over here for the Ukrainians defending in the plant. It's only about 400 meters wide, and so the Russians would have the ability to connect between their 2 remaining vectors here, their 2 salients, and cut off the Ukrainians once again. And there's no reason for the Ukrainians, well, there is, but they would not want to lose control over such a massive facility, which plays a role in dragging out the fighting for so long. And so from a Ukrainian perspective, if they're already in the process of counterattacking and have done so with the 12th Brigade, which clearly has the capacity to conduct counterattacks, and also the Skala Battalion is an assault battalion that is conducted before counterattacks in New York, then they could have the opportunity now to push a bit further south and get control over some other salients over here that are putting pressure from the east and the west towards the facility. That's something that we could see in the future. And you could see that based on these 2 salients that the Russians have under their control, they are sticking out specifically to the west. This is where it's more threatening, because to the west, this Russian vector is not only putting pressure onto Nelipivka, but it could also branch out westwards and put a lot of strain onto Sukha Balka. Because you can see the Russians here have advanced along a really important ridge. This ridge just totally dominates Sukha Balka and the other accompanying villages here. And so since the Russians don't have a massive priority in taking it over right now, it's not at the center of news stories, but it's definitely an area that they could really turn their attention to and take over, given the fact that it is in close proximity. They have road access, they have the ability to override the trenches built by the Ukrainians, and they're overlooking it. So that's an area that definitely should be looked at by the Ukrainians when they're thinking about localized counterattacks. But I think that the immediate goal is just put pressure off of this plant. Now, to look at the situation on the Pokrovsk front, we've been hearing now for a couple of days from Ukrainian sources that they've been able to, in relative terms, stabilize the line leading to Pokrovsk. That is correct in the literal sense that if you're measuring the Pokrovsk front from the region of Novotoretsk all the way to like Novohordivka, there have been minimal Russian advances. The one that I could think of from this past week is a minor Russian incursion past the northern section of Novohordivka all the way into this mine here, and it was spotted by the 93rd Mechanized Brigade. and they fired towards those areas. And so there is still some Russian movement as they try to solidify control over any sort of Ukrainian village or even Slakeep in this case, located south of this defense line. And the Ukrainians really are banking on this defense line because you could see based on its extent, it's basically going around this eastern and southern perimeter of both Pokrovsk and Murhad. This is the second to last line the Ukrainians have that is really complete, you could say. There are some that you can see just east of Murhad, but again, they're not fully encircling all of its eastern flank, and so it wouldn't be fully effective in repelling a Russian advance. The only other line that you have is immediately outside of Pokrovsk, and definitely the Ukrainians don't want to fall back to the line at the moment. They would like to send in forces. A lot of reinforcements were recently sent in, as we've covered extensively in, I believe, the past video. They were moved in with the intention of stabilizing the line along these trenches to buy time as the Ukrainians turn Pokrovsk into a large fortified hub with getting a lot of the civilians out. I believe it's at like 20,000 that are still left in Pokrovsk right now, and the rail traffic for civilians has been shut off. So they're going to have to get out by other means, and then the shipment of those people through rail has to continue in Pavlohrad. And so that's a concern, but again, they're trying to get the people out very quickly now, given the fact especially that the Russians are increasing significantly the amount of artillery and FAB strikes now that it is closer to the line of contact. That is completely understandable. Moving in D-20s and D-30s across the Vavcha River. Now those shorter range howitzers can be utilized to fire directly to Pokrovsk, not to mention, of course, all of the self-propelled howitzers the Russians are using that have like a range of 20-30 kilometers. Those are now going to be used directly to hit into the center of the city. Especially as the Ukrainians take positions in apartment buildings and in large structures, the Russians are going to notice that and fire towards those regions directly. So you're going to see just large-scale destruction over these next few weeks towards this region. But in terms of ground advances, the Ukrainians have really taken the understanding and the risk that moving units away from other parts of the front line is necessary in order to hold on and buy time for this eastern flank of Pokrovsk. They did that most notably by moving in recently the 93rd Mechanized Brigade, at least 4,000 of its 8,000 forces, according to my estimates, along with the 71st Jaeger Brigade. That's another unit that was moved away from an active part of the fighting, specifically around Vovchansk. And then you have a few other units that really didn't have a presence on the front line. They were either National Guard units that were sort of tangentially connected to a front line or were on the rear completely, and some new units that were formed. I talk about it in detail in my last video, so look at that. Where we're seeing a large concentration of Russian focus isn't necessarily on Pokrovsk or Selydove, which we'll talk about, but it's on this front that is directly adjacent to the Vavcha River, which has been the area that I've talked about the most and that I've said should be looked at the most. And we're going to get to why in a second, but first, let's just take a look at what's going on in Selydove. Just to zoom in over here, the Ukrainians didn't just fortify Pokrovsk and send in reinforcements there. They did the same thing in Selydove. So in Selydove, for a while now, I've been sort of skeptical of reports from the Russian side that they've been able to infiltrate and fully capture the southeastern district of the city, including the local hospital. So I never showed that on my map. The sort of largest extent of Russian control has always been sort of stable with the Russians just west of this highway over here, in control of this local mine and Slakeep, in control of certain parts of Seltralna Avenue and the houses of Mikhailivka. And then after that, you do have DRG units that crossed over Seltralna Avenue and made their way all the way to the actual houses in Selydove. Some did it through the dachas directly, and others probably did it further southwards through fields. Now, at a certain point in time, it's likely that they did operate around the hospital and even near the citadel over here. But it was never a serious amount. It was never a permanent quantity that made it reasonable to actually change it to be solidly under Russian control. So I never did that. And it's why we always had a sort of ambiguity, because there was never enough proof to back up that they were staying there on a permanent basis, probably because they never did. But the Ukrainians did not have control over it either. On the Ukrainian side, that control, at least completely under their control, that nobody disputes, really taking control over the center of Selydove and the southern sections near the Solona River. Since then, it's been reported universally by both Russian and Ukrainian sources that the Ukrainians conducted a localized counterattack over here, taking control of at least, and it's probably higher than this, 1.56 square kilometers, because I'm only taking into account the regions that I marked on my map as a gray zone that the Ukrainians took back. But in all likelihood, this region that I see here marked in X, this is also probably in the gray zone and should be marked as under new Ukrainian control, because now we know for sure that they're actually here permanently. The reason why the Ukrainians succeeded in taking back this particular piece of territory is important to note, because we know for sure that the Ukrainians are really backing up their garrison here with the 15th Karadag National Guard Brigade, which was again defending in the Zaporizhia region. In addition to this, there are reports that the 72nd Mechanized Brigade was moved from Vuhledar to defend here, and that would be an additional 4,000 men, in addition to the 2,000 in this National Guard units. We don't know if that's true, but I would say it is heavily likely that besides the 15th Brigade, there is at least one other unit that is supporting it. It could be the 72nd, and if it's not, because we can't verify that, there's no proof yet, then it will be the 117th Mechanized Brigade, another unit that was moved in from the Zaporozhye region. Now, if you add up all three, then it would be a really large number of forces, because it would be 4,000 plus 4,000 combined. It's going to be 8,000 troops that are generally located here. Maybe not all of them fighting within the city itself, but generally in the sector could be moved in and rotated. And so that is a large number, and that is a concentration that really dwarfs the initial amount, which was so little, maybe in the hundreds. So it is a significant improvement. Now, what they did is, while all these reinforcements were pouring in, they did yield control over the dachas because they knew they didn't have the wherewithal to hold on to them. And they concentrated in a singular sort of region in the center around the citadel with all those high-rise apartment buildings. It gave them a perfect line of sight to fire towards any Russians that approached them and repelled any sort of Russian attack that was too deep into Selydove. And so that's how they were able to hold on to it during the most critical period. And now what we're seeing is they've amassed enough of a force to actually conduct the localized counterattack. At the same time, the Russian forces are also building up in Mikhailivka, but their DRG attacks were rather speculative, and you have to remember, these units have been advancing for a significant period of time, for over a month and a half, and so they have reached a point where they are rather fatigued, and they've advanced so deep that they do need to have some sort of operational pause, rotation in certain cases, and get rearmed. All of that is important to note. And so them being even further stretched out into the center of a major city, it just wasn't realistic at the time. And so those really did end up occurring in failure. And if you're just looking at DRGs, then it could have been possible that those DRGs were sent into probe, and they just realized that the Ukrainian defense was too strong, and they eventually gave up on those sort of harassment operations as the Ukrainians were sent in to finally clear out the gray zone. So that's what we've seen now, that the Ukrainians are back in control of the entirety of the residential parts of Selydove, also advancing along Seltrana Avenue, taking over some of the dachas in the hinterlands between the two settlements. Now, there is still some sort of gray zone around this Kolochotka mine, I think it's called, which some Russian sources claim is under Russian control, but that can't be verified. For now, I'm leaving this region here in the middle as the gray zone. We do know that there's been really a focal point of fighting where almost all the footage has come out from, and this is the rail bridge. This rail bridge, it's important because there's really only one road in this axis to lead into Selydove, and the Russian forces would have, of course, wanted to use it, and it's located right under that bridge. And so the Ukrainians made sure to maintain a presence here, not necessarily under the bridge directly, but sending in vehicles and troops to fire towards any Russian garrison that was moving closer. And so it had various efforts over the past week from Russian tanks, BTRs, etc., to cross over, and they did not actually yield any results. The Ukrainians were there with drone crews and also their own BTRs and tanks firing towards the Russian ones and destroying them. So there are several pieces of equipment, probably up to 5 now, that were destroyed by the Ukrainians. And eventually the Russians just wanted them to basically be used as a barrier, to set up a barrier of all the sort of hunks of Russian vehicles that were destroyed in order to block off any sort of Ukrainian access to cross over the sort of junction here and then push eastwards towards the Russian holdings in Mikhailivka. That was eventually the new Russian objective. And the Ukrainians were able to prevent this from occurring by sending in an IMR-2 that cleared up the way for any sort of Ukrainian vehicle to cross through. And so no longer were the Russian destroyed vehicles blocking the way for Ukrainians. And so what happened afterwards is that you had additional Russian tanks come in, additional squads dismount, Several times they were targeted by Ukrainian drones and direct fire. And then you had a video of a Ukrainian BTR crossing over here and just running in circles along this portion of Mikhailivka, pushing into areas that we know are under Russian control and firing directly with their cannon, targeting Russian infantry and getting control over additional areas that you see marked in blue. So that includes this area that I'm going to hover over with this red rectangle that is a part of the BTR foray. And so it's important to note that the Ukrainians have now taken a more active role after being rather passive for the past couple of days. Now that's changed once they got their necessary reinforcements, and it shows the Ukrainians are clear that they're not going to cede Selydove without a fight. It's very critical for them to maintain control over the entirety of the eastern perimeter, and now that includes some of the dachas, because they'd rather that the fighting gets sort of bogged down over there than it reach the actual center nerve of the city. Now we're going to move southwards because there is an important development around Ukrainsk. The 25th Airborne Brigade is defending here. It's the main unit that's been tasked with holding up that town. They've been able to prevent frontal assaults coming from the north. Those were unsuccessful, but the issue is Dolinivka was captured and there wasn't any sort of Ukrainian pushback. There was no necessary troops sent in to prevent a future Russian advance along a similar axis. And so this past week, the Russians have focused on solidifying control over Halitsynivka. They succeeded, took over Dolinivka, and they're using the tree lines that branch out of that hamlet to advance southwards without being noticed by the Ukrainians. They've been able to do this successfully numerous times along this part of the front line, using the just immense density of the forested areas to push towards local Ukrainian defensive sections that are just completely unmanned due to their proximity to the front line and just a lack of manpower in those key regions. Of course, now that's being alleviated, but it's happened so quickly in a frenzy that they can't reach an area like this over here marked in yellow in time. And so the Russians, of course, in a lot of cases, take over these trenches empty. They were able to, in all likelihood, advance in this southwestern direction and then make a turn into Lysivka once they reached this vertical road. And then from there, they advanced along the paved route and took over the entirety of Lysivka. So now this village is under Russian control. And it's not just ending there. The Russians then branch out even more and continue to utilize this really deep forested entrenchment to push into the southern section of Ukrainsk. And not just into the southern section of Ukrainsk, but also further southwards with the objective of reaching this rail line that connects between Hirnik and Tsurkunie to the northwest. The goal would be to, of course, sever connections between the two nearby settlements that are actually rather large in nature and do house a lot of the recent reinforcements that were moved in by the Ukrainians. So, of course, there's an interest in blocking them off, preventing them from coordinating together on defensive actions. So while the Russian forces really have really reduced their steam in Pokrovsk and Selydove, the extent of the advances is continuing to show on not maybe a daily basis, but on a bi-daily basis in this part of the front line that is located just north of the Vavcha River. We can see here the Russians took over in yellow 5.3 square kilometers and have done so by, again, taking control of trees east of Ukrainsk and also a bit to the south. As a result, we now know that videos from the Ukrainian army show street fighting in Ukrainsk. Maybe don't show the actual Russian soldiers firing there, but we could hear their gunfire in the midst of the Ukrainians trying to hide in some of these duplexes and apartments in Ukrainsk itself. So you have Russian infiltration occurring from the southern area here, where they're trying to get a foothold into the plantations, from the east directly, where you have holdings in Lysivka that they're now utilizing, and then also from the northeast, you have pushes into some of the local areas. You can see here, it's an area that is less dense in nature. The Russians attempting to push through there all at the same time with the, of course, the objective of overwhelming the Ukrainian forces. And the fall of Ukrainsk would be really important because by then you'd have the ability, if you're on the Russian side, to reach this line of defense that you see marked in yellow, this line of defense that is holding on to Selydove, not necessarily holding on to Selydove, but holding on to its southeastern flank. And pushing through this defense line would mean unadulterated access to this really highly elevated position that overlooks Selydove, also overlooks Tsurkunie. And again, it creates a huge gap in the Ukrainian line because it's not area that is fortified. It would just give the Russians another region to advance through rather quickly and another exploitation. So it is important that Ukrainsk acts as a buffer. In addition to that, also its landfill. That landfill is really important and would give the Russians another local advantage geography-wise. And so having that under their control really would be important then going forward, both for the northern direction, Selydove, and for the south, looking at an area like Hirnik. Because you can see it's not just about taking over Ukrainsk, but also about bypassing it from the south, continuing to advance along this paved route over here, and reaching all the way to Hirnik. Hirnik is important because the fall of this village would give Russians access to a huge settlement with, again, logistics, because it's a train route with all these paved roads branching out of it. Also because recent reinforcements from the 119th Brigade are probably stationed over here, so it would disrupt their new formation and getting accustomed to the front line. And also it's on huge, really high elevation, as we said before, this area in the X, and it leads naturally into Kharkivka, which would give Russians, again, control over even more villages that are located along the Vavcha River and help seal off any remaining Ukrainians that are defending in this huge salient that has not been vacated yet. It would also give them really high elevation to overlook those Ukrainian troops as they try to retreat. And most importantly, it would really leave the Russians pretty close to Krakow from the northern flank. That's really a huge goal, to finally connect the garrisons, the Russian vectors that are occurring to the east from Hirivka to the ones that are occurring along the Vavcha River line to the north. And that could all be done via the conduits of Hirnik, which is why the Russians, even though they gave up on really significant pushes in two cities for the time being, they've not given up on it in this one region, because they still sense there's an opportunity to cause a huge shift in the front line that could have mid-range consequences for other cities in this region over here. Because at the moment, the Ukrainians have not fully vacated these fields and these trenches. They're still holding on to it with the hope of dragging out the fighting. So you do have several battalions operating around here, including near Nevelska and Krasnohorovka. So the front line does still look like this, with a lot of these fields remaining in blue. But as the front line gets really tighter and tighter, it's going to become way more dangerous for the Ukrainians to remain there, especially once they reach an area like Hirnik or Kharkivka. And so, yeah, that's all I have for today. This video was rather long. I apologize for that, but thank you all for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.